Hello and welcome to Iranian Voices, a program exploring events in Iran that impact our lives in America and the world. I am your host, Marilee Buster. On this program, we will be asking questions and exploring events you aren't likely to hear about through mainstream sources. We will be exploring Iran's democratic and human rights history and the human rights issues and violations in modern Iran. We will begin to discuss the grassroots movement that is now manifesting in protests against the current fundamentalist regime and what that movement means to Americans. My guest for this program is Sima Yazdani, a mother, wife, and working woman. Ms. Yazdani is active in human rights issues and has firsthand knowledge of human rights practices and policies in Iran. She is founder of United for a Free Iran, a nonprofit educational and cultural organization advocating human rights and democracy. She is a brilliant modern woman, and she was granted 6 patents for Cisco Systems, her employer, on metadata innovations. Sima Yazdani, welcome to Iranian Voices.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for having such a program and providing opportunity for us to present our perspective.
You're welcome. I would like to start the questions about Iran and asking you about the pre-Shah Iran and what that was like.
Very good question, because many times I wonder what is happening now in Iran. Where is the window for hope and or change? You have to look back and look at the past history and what has been happening. When I remember and do research and look at some of the important milestones and achievement that had been passed in the past 100 years, I start seeing the trend and the pattern. And that's
Could you explain a little bit about what it was like for the viewers? Hopefully we'll have some American viewers, but I think Americans by and large don't know much of what it was like before the current regime.
Yes, actually, if we go back at least 100 years back, we can even go all the way to ancient Persia. I mean, I have to say this is I recently found, and it was very interesting. Ancient Persians celebrated Women's Day. They had a day that they named it and after the name of one of their guardian angels, and then it was the Women's Day, and men would celebrate and bring gifts to women. So the history of ancient Persia is very rich, full of cultural events, programs, and but I want to zoom back to the past 100 years, and 1906, 1907. At the turn of the past century, a lot was happening in Iran. It was after years of very repressive monarchies. The monarchy at the time was called Qajar. And 1906 and 1907, these are the years of the constitutional movement. Intellectuals, dissidents, after years of protest of the repressive policies and of the regime, of the monarchy, the Qajar regime at the time, they were able to force the king at the time to sign the decree to have a national parliament, so that people's representations participate in the governing of the country.
And the women's role at that time, were they able also to participate?
Yes, that's what's so amazing. That's what I found. There are many, many occasions that women participated in this constitutional movement. At times they even fought against the dictators. They were among them. Through poetry, through their actual participation in women's group, they formed women's group. They put together their own journals, newspapers, magazine. They fought for having schools for girls. Through many aspects, they participated. When I look at that history, I see that women in Iranian recent history, the push for democracy and liberation, they were not only present, they were in the forefront.
And I'd like to mention too that while we are speaking about women's rights here, it is not because we are so focused on only what women need, but because women's rights and women in countries, how they're treated, the policies around them, are very indicative of the health of the policies in that country. And as such, that seems to be why we've come to this focus today.
Yes, definitely, very related. Actually, United Nations has many, many articles that talks about that. When they look at the women's right, the number one problem and topic, the issue that they focus on is violence against women. Violence against women at the family level, at the relationship level, at the community, country level. Actually, from that perspective, when we look at Iran, violence against women is institutionalized, legalized, promoted, and forced
in the modern
Iran by the regime. That's what's so different in Iran than the rest of the world.
Because that's not traditional for Iran.
No, we don't have that. And actually, when we go back, as I said, the constitutional movement, we have women who were activists, and they knew that participating in women's group, having women's school for girls, adds to their understanding, encourages their participation in the society.
Strengthens the society.
Exactly, what we call today women empowerment. They were active to bring that to the society at that time. I wanted to read a quote of one of those pioneers of the time to just create an atmosphere for you. The lady, this is as of May 10, 1907, a lady called Bibi Khanum Estarabadi. She was one of the founders of the first girls' school in Iran called Dushizegan.
And when was that again?
She founded the school in 1945, but in 1907, she wrote this in an article in newspaper because as early as that, she was active for women's rights and participation. Just to look at that, at the time there was a newspaper called Tamaddon, which means civilization. She wrote an article in that newspaper saying some people with their own benefits in mind are afraid that if the women of the capital, which is Tehran, gained an understanding, they would no longer put up with oppression and would demand the rights that have long been denied. This is 1907. And women activists now in Iran, 100 years later, repeating the same sentence. The same cause, the same motivation, and they are being faced with the same enemy. At the time, they were the oppressors, primarily represented by the clerics, and who wanted to stick to the traditions that definitely would take away the freedom of choice from people, including women.
So what happened to that movement then? There was a parliamentary movement, and
yes.
Then what happened?
So parliament got formed. But 2 years later, of course, the king, with the collaboration of the corrupt mullahs of the time, they closed the parliament, bombed the parliament. But it took only 4 months. Uprising happened all over Iran, from Tabriz, Shiraz, Isfahan, Mashhad, southern Bandar Abbas. Uprising happened all over, and the freedom fighters came to the capital and reconvened the parliament and pushed back the corrupt king and the corrupt mullahs at that time.
Who were already beginning with terrorism.
Yes. So you see, and then we have many of these struggles. Every time people got together, got motivated, and they were willing to sacrifice and formed and got organized, they made a lot of progress. They moved forward. They passed laws. They were able to open their newspapers, their schools. But again, on the side, when we look at that history, there were always those corrupt mullahs that were always trying to be against that.
And what do you think the motivation was?
That's a very good question, Mary. The motivation is that their line of thinking is based on gender discrimination. Misogyny is the pillar of the cleric rule.
Now, is that Islam in general?
No, I don't think we need to draw the line. This is because it's Islam or non-Islam. If we look at back the Dark Ages or even prior to that, you see that it's about having control, complete control over your lives and your resources. Mm-hmm. It's all about that. So the religion becomes a tool here. And that's, we totally see that in Iran today, that how they utilize the religion, the Shiite belief, to say this is according to that faith, which is not true. The scholars in this field, they all see that this is a complete misinterpretation. It's just very demonic representation, and their own behavior, when you look at it, it explains.
Yes, it belies
yes.
what they're speaking about,
yes.
as far as spiritual values and those things, then with their actions are actually
yes.
telling more.
So what's interesting, the line I like to draw is that when Khomeini got in power, 1979, he took advantage of the vacuum of the organized freedom movement, because there were no organized freedom movement as a result of years of repression during the Shah's regime. So he used that, but the people were still asking for that freedom of speech, freedom of participation in the government.
Let me just back up too, because the Shah was not part of the parliament.
No, so so that's a very good question. Actually, the parliament that got formed in 1907 was called Iranian National Parliament, and it emphasized that it needs to be a representative of all the ethnic groups, regardless of the religion or race. When Khomeini got into power, they dismantled the previous parliament and they called it Islamic parliament. So automatically they started taking these moves to crystallize the power under a select group of the mullahs.
So there was already a parliament and a declaration in place.
Yes.
1907.
1907.
And then the coup that we know now was supported by the CIA to install the Shah.
That was 1950s. In the 1950s that happened. So in 1950s, we had been having parliamentary participation for some time.
So it was still active at that time.
Another element was the role of the colonialism. The British and Russian colonial influences, again, being coupled with the corrupt mullahs. So we always see that these corrupt mullahs always had this support, and they wanted to have the support of these colonial powers. And they allowed their influence in order to push back people participation and push back the trend toward democracy. Mm-hmm. We see that very clearly. We see that how mullahs opposed Mossadegh and his progress plans.
Mossadegh was the
Mossadegh was actually the prominent democratic prime minister we had in 1950s, that he came to power with the popular uprising. So it represents that in our Iranian recent history, that Iranian people have been struggling to gain democracy. That was, the constitutional movement, a big achievement. The rise of Mossadegh to power was the next big achievement. And then with respect to women, women protested to have right to vote. And that happened after that. Again, mullahs opposed that. So we see in every one of these significant milestones that Iranian people progress toward democracy. These corrupt mullahs are standing against the people. Mm-hmm. And
where were they getting their power from?
Well, they were Iranian culture is a multicultural, with many ethnic groups, many religions. Actually, I was raised in Isfahan. It's a very good examples of that. Many friends who were Armenian, who were Jewish, who were Baha'is, who were Zoroastrian. I mean, you could easily find members of those faiths in your neighborhood, and you would be friends, or you would meet them in schools. At least I did. And you could, but your belief, your religious belief was yours, personal, and then there are traditions, programs, depending on the family participation. It was, at the end of the day, your choice. That's key. It's not about forcing this religion or that religion. What the regime did after coming to power, it wasn't even less than a month. It was in March of 1979 that they announced that there needs to be compulsory veiling. And the women were among the first major social sectors and groups that protested. They poured into the streets.
And this is at that time you mentioned when the Shah was ousted,
yes,
and there was the uprising, that left a void in many of the important offices around, and that the mullahs and the fundamentalists moved in very quickly to fill those places.
Yes, many of the leaders and intellectuals were still in prison, and people opened the doors of the prison,
that
released
the Shah
them.
had imprisoned?
Yes, so they hardly had any chance to get organized groups. So the regime got in power without any legitimacy. So they started attacking any movement towards getting organized and getting societies formed. So they would send these paramilitary groups, just like what's happening in Iraq, you see, to attack these organizations and their offices. Many newspapers and magazines opened because there was just a new opportunity for freedom because of the Shah dictatorship was ousted. So many groups started getting formed, many newspapers got founded, but again the regime was just too busy attacking them and again trying to suppress that freedom of expression and a little bit of political freedom.
They seem to have a
gained.
sophisticated understanding of what works to bring to power and what's how important it is to either have the choice for the liberty and the freedom to speak, or how important it is if you want to oppress that so that you can keep a group in. They're very sophisticated in their knowledge and workings.
Yeah, they all. So I think.
So 1 month after, you said, 1 month after coming into power.
Yeah, they announced that you gotta cover your hair and you gotta, they announced, how your outfit should be, and that trend still continues and it's getting worse. So.
And why didn't people just say no and not wear them?
And they did. That's exactly what I want to say. That one of the first protests, even though people were at the time very optimistic, there is a change of regime and there is an opportunity for progress. But again, that's what the regime did. It was a big warning sign, and many intellectuals who could have enough foresight for the future, even women with Islamic belief who were covering their hair, they joined the protest against the government's decree. And many who are leading the resistance movement today, at the time, they were side by side with all the other women who did not want to choose to cover their hair. And at that time, I would say that was when the regime declared its war against people of Iran who wanted freedom and liberty.
And how? How did they do that?
So, it's very symbolic. I don't want to let the covering your hair is symbolic of the fact that you have no control over your life. I dictate to you what to wear, what to say, where to go, what field to study, what jobs you can do, how you can travel, any custody right. So from that point on, regime started moving away from international standards of human rights and women's rights, and specific women's rights Iranian women have gained over that 7 years at that time. And it took only 2 years after the revolution that we had such a repressive crackdown on personal freedoms, on political freedoms, on freedom of expression.
And I've heard of it happening that women on the streets might be targeted by police for having a headscarf that is a little too far back, shows too much hair, or if they have a color on, they certainly can't wear lipstick or anything that makeup.
If you look at their government, Iranian regime's penal codes and civil code, you see that they consider all of these a violation of morality.
And so they are jailed, or?
Yes, so they are condemned to have slashes, so they take you to prison, and so many of slashes, and then so many months, so many years of prison sentence. And at that point, any resistance toward that ruling, your sentence gets worse. there were many, many occasions that the defending lawyer in the court defending the human rights activists and women rights activists, they were arrested.
The lawyers were.
The lawyers got arrested. So that is, I just, I'm going on these events, kind of to illustrate that not only this regime has attacked the personal freedoms, basic personal freedoms, and the rights that United Nations International Declaration of Human Rights have already approved, and Iranian government is supposed to be a signatory to that rule. They're supposed to support it and report on its compliance. They are not. So that's a big issue here. And not only that, people, when they protest, and when, according to the legal proceedings, you have lawyers, even your lawyers are not allowed to defend you. And so the judicial system and all the civil codes, everything, all these different branches of the government, they are all following,
like facades.
Yes, they're all following the same line of thinking.
And what can the UN do then? Can they enforce that these reports are made and accounted for?
Very good question. It takes us to the policy option. That's one of my interest area. That this is not the first time United Nations is faced with a government that is not complying. And it's not the first time that probably the government has not complied once or twice. Over 50 times United Nations General Council have condemned Iran for violation of human rights. Amnesty International, even the last few days, we had many alerts coming from Amnesty International regarding youth being sentenced to execution, women being sentenced to stoning, very barbaric form of punishment.
I understand there was just recently, there was a young man, 20-something, that had a problem of drinking, and he was drunk in public, and they stoned him to death. Is that correct?
So, and actually, what is important here is that when we look at the corruption, the Iranian regime is the source of corruption, is the source of creating an environment for Iranian people in terms of unemployment. There is such a high unemployment, there is such a high level of hopelessness.
And there's no accountability. They have to answer to no one for this, but the United Nations,
well, they lie. So that's what's very interesting. Iranian people came to know this, that this regime is the worst liar. And actually, when it comes to Persian cultures, they always knew that. We have an example of, we use the fox, the animal fox. And the animal fox is like, of course, very deceitful. So they characterize these mullahs like fox. They are deceitful. They are master of deceit. So when they come to international bodies, when they interact, so when you have Iranian regime representing Iranian people, which with all these violations, they are not the proper representation, and then you have international bodies, either United Nations or other countries around the world, and then you see the interactions. If these interactions are helping the Iranian regime to stay in power, in a way, they are indirectly helping the violation of human rights against general public, against the ethnic groups, against all the religions, against the youth.
Our trade deals, when we...
To continue.
Yes, we bring up in our trade deals that a country must have a certain standard of human rights, and if they don't have those, we tend to bargain it and so go ahead and do our trade with them, hoping that they will change.
Yes, so when I look at these pictures around us, I see there are pictures of human trafficking, that there are documented by Women Freedom Forum, by university professors, that Iranian clerical regime and the guards are directly and indirectly involved in the human trafficking. When I look at the pictures of the students uprising, I look at them as the talents. These are the ones who can do innovations. They are the ones who can do all sorts of innovation in science, technology, education, society. They can be leaders, and they show their leadership skills in these protests. They are the future leaders of our society, and they are being, for their protests, for not having guards present present on university campus or asking for their equal pay, they get arrested. Asking for the equal rights when it comes to child custody.
So in those pictures, those were the signs they were holding
yes,
up asking for?
Yes, for example, insurance for women. Equal insurance for women, equal access to health for women, equal access to education. All of these signs are considered moves against the security of the regime. That's how regime titles them.
A security threat.
Yes, it becomes a security threat, and as long as a security threat, you're taken to the prison, your belonging, your properties, your rights, your licenses, all taken over. And basically, you have no more control over your lives.
And if a family member complains, they may be subject to
arrest. We had many, many occasions of that. We had many, many occasions that people, while they were under interrogations, they haven't even announced for what fault you arrested them. The next day, the family was called to come and take the bodies. There was about a couple months ago, we had a student who was arrested, and the next day the student was killed. We had Zahra Kazemi, the journalist from Canada, that she got killed throughout that whole proceeding.
While she was in custody.
So you had a very good question earlier. What is the United Nations or international body who are supposed to govern and administer the compliance of these? When they send their monitors to Iran and they come back with a report that the regime have produced that says, yes, we are making progress toward human rights, we are making progress towards civil society, why they don't question it? The facts are there. The people are there. Today in Iran, you cannot have a non-governmental organization working on social issues. You cannot, every association has to be directly linked with the government and approved. Otherwise, you have no license to operate. Even those in the constitution, which by the way, this regime changed it. The constitution we had in 1907, this regime changed it, and they added all these barbaric punishments and all these rulings that was cutting down on the individual freedom and and the group's society's freedom. So according to that, even though it's allowed, you can form an association. Again, it's illegal today. So there are, if you look at it from a very objective perspective, just like a researcher, a good, honest scholar and researcher, you go in, there are many, many reasons that Iranian regime should not be allowed into United Nations. The seat should be given to true representative of Iranian people who are suffering. You see them. These are in these pictures. They risk their lives, they risk their future, their education in universities to get out and hold signs and take pictures. Look, they are many of them covering their faces because they know they could be immediately identified.
You and I had spoken about these pictures before the program, because when an American looks at these pictures, they look pretty benign and look like a protest that might happen anywhere in America. But to explain that they're not allowed to wear color, and so these the red colors, and there was one beautiful picture of a woman with a blue bandana underneath her black covering. But that is actually something she's doing in violation of the law.
It's an expression. I mean, look at here, people all sorts of T-shirts with messages or bumper stickers. What are they doing? They're expressing how they feel, what they think. With these, actually Iranian women, they are, it's not that they have no issues and fashion is their only issue. No, this is probably the only means left for them. They say, I exist, I have rights, and I do not put up with your oppression. And I demand my equal rights. I demand to be treated like a human being. I demand my dignity be respected. And
at great risk to themselves.
Yes.
They're wearing these colors.
And these are the demands that this regime cannot stand. So by choosing to attack women, in a way they are choosing to attack the rest of the society.
Certainly if they make women very afraid and they make the families afraid to support them or to stand up for them, and then that's pretty much the whole country they have under a thumb.
Exactly.
And now tell me a little bit about, there is this grassroots movement that we're beginning to see. These are the people who are protesting.
Yes.
This was not just a spontaneous protest. This is actually organized.
Yeah, you can see that with every small protest, you can be arrested, your property can be confiscated, your right to finish your education can be taken away, your right to have a job, or probably travel, leave the country. All those, you can easily lose all those rights. You become an object, complete control under the regime. So they still do that because they're trying to send a message for their generation, for the rest of the world. What we are facing in Iran is a full-fledged war between a fascist, religious, fundamentalist regime against people who are asking for freedom, liberty, and safety, peace. And they are not armed. They are not armed. These are all peaceful protests. But look at the amount of number of police and special agencies and intelligence service and the amount of money this regime spends on propaganda around the world. They buy scholars, they buy journalists,
because they have the complete resources of the country at
yes,
their
complete.
hands.
And that's how they to cover up what's going on. But truth never stays undercover. We know that throughout human history. And every individual, every one of these people who are protesting, they are the light of the earth. The way I look at them, they are the one who are in that darkness. They are being a single candle, bringing the light of the truth. That this is not what we ask for. This is not what we want to put up, and this is not what we want for our future generation. We're gonna do whatever we can to change that.
And make these, allow voices to be heard, allow people to live their lives in freedom. Which brings me to the question of how this affects Americans. And if we're watching this, or most of the time we don't even know that it's happening because it doesn't seem to show up on our radar. However, I did do a little bit of internet research and started finding a lot of stories. There's a lot going on in Iran, and it surprised me that none of it seems to show up on the nightly news. So I have to start looking at other sources.
That's a very good question. Many Iranians are wondering, and they are feeling disappointed that what happened to all those cameramen, to all those news media, who, when Iranian people having their uprising against the dictatorship, 1979 dictatorship in Iran against Shah, they were Khomeini and his crew, who hardly protested against Shah. They hardly said anything to get Shah or Savak upset. They were surrounded 50 or so in Paris with all those cameras and media, and there was such a daily coverage about that time. I was here in the US. But now, last year, there was 50,000 Iranian people around the world from 50,000 from many corners of the world. They gathered, they protested the violation of human rights. They asked for democratic change in Iran. And with the resistant movement that has been organized in the past 25 years, and with the resistant movement leadership, National Council of Resistance, which is an organized leadership movement. And the 50,000 people gathered, and it didn't get much. It got some covering. It got some covering. That definitely got coverage, but not equivalent to the coverage I saw in 1979. So that's a very good question. If the journalists or media is supposed to be objective and represent the fact, then that's a question. How come it's not happening? If individuals like me or Iranian people are not advocating, then let's do it. That's why I responded to your call and doing this interview. All we have to do is tell the fact, what we hear, what we feel from our family members, what's happening to them, the amount of hopelessness, the amount of addiction, rise of addiction, the amount of rise of suicide by setting themselves in fire. Is so high that if you look at it from any just slight level of research, you can see this shows that there is a lot of repression going on. And who is doing this repression? Is the regime.
And we can help by asking questions, asking our representatives if they would look into what's going on, if they would keep us informed of human rights violations. If we have delegates in the UN, we could email.
Definite policy option. There are many policies. There are a very important policy options here. It doesn't require any spending of any budget, U.S. budget or any other country's budget. Iranian people, just like any individual who want to defend their home, they want to defend the security of their own country. They consider the regime is the #1 enemy who is threatening their personal security, their family's security, and their country's security. They need to be supported, morally supported. We don't need any invasion, any war against Iran would actually help the regime to stay in power.
The war would help them to stay in power.
Yes, so definitely that's not a good option. Continuing the so-called negotiation and appeasement, and as a result of that, ignoring the opposition and the organized resistance movement that is happening, is also definitely not helping. It's have been prolonging the life of this regime. The life of this regime got prolonged. This regime is financing terrorism around the world. Now, if people couldn't believe it before, look what's happening in Iraq now. Look what happened in Lebanon a year ago. This regime is financing any effort that destabilizes the security of the Middle East, and any terrorist group that may want to attack let's say Western countries.
And much of their financing comes out of the sale of the resources, the oil out of
sale
Iran.
Of the oil of Iran, rather than the funding to be spent on development projects, on building the opportunities for youth to have employment, so they can have a decent earning, they can have a decent life, they can get married, they can buy properties. They cannot do any of those. The inflation is just mind-boggling.
As a point too, I remember you telling me about where you grew up in Isfahan, and how across the street from your home there was a school. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show about your first-hand experience. Tell me about that school.
Actually, it was the youth organization facility. It was a very nice youth organization with the nice lawn, amphitheaters, that art programs could be presented, classrooms, and it was connected. A community center connected to a couple of colleges, I think, in the city. At that time, I was in high school, so I couldn't use it much. But I heard after revolution, the regime closed down that place, and then later on opened it up as a place to train the paramilitary group and suicide bombers. This regime actually advertises in their own paper that they hire people, men or women, to come and be trained to so-called export Iranian regime's form of justice to the world.
And why would someone do that if they were?
Brainwashing takes different shape and form. But at the end of the day, when I look at it, because my work is with NGOs and international development, the root is that when there is hopelessness, when there is no opportunity for development, when there is no empowerment, personal empowerment, you are trained to believe that you have no control over your lives, and you need to follow these directions to have a salvation.
And told often enough that if the way to salvation and the way to heaven is one certain way, that they keep repeating.
And then they get financed. Many of them, like mercenary, they get.
They wouldn't be able to leave money to their family.
They not only family themselves. Yes, for example, the university admissions. The government completely controlled university admissions, and they have been reserving a good portion of it for these people who accepted to be some sort of mercenary for the regime, and participate in the crackdown, participate in the operation. They in schools, in society, in streets, in alleys, in the places of employment, in anywhere they could see, they could operate. They go back to the regime, and they as part of these agencies they're part of, they get lots of money. So it's a form of lucrative employment to participate in the destruction that the regime is doing.
Which would be very tempting if you were living in a culture and society where you were looking at very high unemployment and inflation and repression by government and certain jailing just for simple things, or you could become a friend to the government and be paid a lot of money and live a very nice, comfortable lifestyle.
Yeah, it's like a mafia system. When you look at it, so as you said, it's sophisticated, the regime is sophisticated. Yes, they studied how Hitler operated, how Mussolini operated, how the mafia system and gangs operate in communities, and leverage all the lessons and best practices of dark ages. You go back, you see all that. You see what Dracula did in Europe in those years. You see all those worst practices that humanity put it behind. Mm-hmm. And as part of civilization, it should be behind us. I mean, stoning, when you look at the Jesus parable, 2,000 years ago, should have been abolished. We didn't have it in our culture. I don't even remember it. The only time we remember it was in stories, in Bible. We read it that those days they did that. Mm-hmm. And it's happening today in Iran. Of course, regime doesn't want the rest of the world to know, but if you open the judicial books, they sentence people and they actually carried it out in hiding. They cut limbs, hands and legs for petty thieves, whereas the regime itself is the grand thief.
And you mentioned exporting, and I don't know if this is an example actually of exporting, but you had told me earlier about a story that happened in Canada of an honor killing.
Yes. You know, the threat of fundamentalism as this Khomeini's regime got into power is threatening the rest of the world. What I mentioned is the impact of this regime on Iranian people. But this regime, in order to stay in power, it has to export its line of thinking. It has to export its agencies and mercenaries across the world and encourage this line of thinking, encourage this line of behavior so that they can create unstable communities and further and further take away the personal freedom and the liberties of civilization.
Mm-hmm. Is there a kind of formula that they use that you can identify?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. You know, when you look at the way, when you just look at the surface of the language of the scholars who support the regime or the regime's the so-called diplomats, they say we are resisting against Western influence. So to them, achievement of humanity, civilization, achievements of Iranian people we have a very rich history of civilization, are against the values our own poets like Hafiz, Saadi, Rumi, and many of our own scholars for years have disseminated. They are against all those. So it's not that they are against Western or Eastern. They are against humanity.
And
so
civilization.
Civilization. So when you read, whenever you listen to their sentences, you gotta be able to. They are doing anything they can to be against civilization and have complete fear and control over countries. So they are moving toward that direction. There was an honor killing in Canada about a month or two ago. I just heard it in the news. So these are indirect result of Iranian regime promotion of religious fascism and elimination of liberty and freedom.
Well, what was the killing about exactly?
I believe the youngster, the teenage young woman, she was writing poetries in her online Facebook or online blogs, that how much she was under pressure and forced by her father to act certain way or wear certain clothes. And she was expressing that my personal freedom is being taken away. And then all of a sudden everyone heard that I think either a family member killed her as part of the honor killing. Iranian regime promotes, legalizes, and sanctions honor killing. So basically, if a father or a brother decides the female member of the family is out of line, like I've heard it was in the news that the daughter of this family got married. After a year or two of living with her new husband, she found out that he's very repressive. So many times she came back home. the family, the father found this as against the honor of the family and had the brother strangle her to death. The government says, yeah, that was, they had the right, they can do that.
So there's no murder charge.
No, so I want to ask United Nations and international bodies and governments who have trade relationship with this regime, that this is the value system they're operating. Sooner or later, then they are, after they say it, to export this value system in every community they can. They're starting with Middle East, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, everywhere, and they're going everywhere they can.
And to ask why, if we have some leverage that we can use, why we're not using it.
So the idea here is be alongside of Iranian people who have suffered and who have sent all these messages with their protest, and the fact that they got organized, they have very organized resistance movement under the ground, and they're, as you said, grassroots moving forward, and align with them. We have a common enemy and isolate this regime. Actually, the resistance movement is so much against the violence, is so much in support of a human rights declaration that they actually announced as part of their charter, they had a big charter about the freedom of the press, freedom of women, freedom of religious practices, freedom of ethnic groups, freedom of associations, and then one of it was removal of execution as a form of sentencing. So Iranian resistance
was this the National Resistance Council?
Yes, that's correct, National Council of Resistance. So when you look at this 100 years of struggle for democracy and freedom, these are all the result of so-called best practices and lessons learned. That you gotta be organized, you gotta have a solid strategy, you gotta be pervasive, extensive, you gotta be sustainable.
Because the fascist fundamentalist regime is very sophisticated.
Very sophisticated. They do anything they can.
Now, but we had mentioned the grassroots movement. This National Council of Resistance is different from that grassroots movement.
No. They are all of the same. There is a lot of independent movement happening in Iran, but the spirit is the same. If you look at all their charters, you see all aligned. They're all saying they're starting with individual freedom, civil freedom, gender equality, either at workplace, at the family law, and they're making their way toward the political freedom. So if you look at, depending on where their focus is, each of these efforts, they're all along the same path. So this is what I want to present, that there is an alternative. Speaking of the policy option, you don't have to just deal with Iranian regime, put up with their illogical behavior and export of terrorism. Support the national movement that is resisting and isolate the regime. Give seats at United Nations to the representative of Iranian people, to the representative of the National Council of Resistance, so that they can present and be an advocate of people. And
we have a very expensive war going on, and I'm not just talking about dollars. And then if that is, as has been said, part of the war on terrorism, or is the war on terrorism, that if we have a way to actually achieve, by winning, achieve a win in this war on terrorism, that we should take especially any means that are peaceful means.
Definitely. I mean, example that comes to my mind, when you have a healthy lawn, the root is healthy, you have very nice lawn. But when it gets full of weeds, no matter how often you cut the leaves of the weeds, this is a lawn that the weeds are growing, and it's getting that bad. That's what's happening in Iran. The ruling government, it's the weeds. The more you just not talk to them, or sanctions are definitely very helpful. I mean, any appeasement, it's going to strengthen those roots, those weeds. We don't want that. But what you want is strengthen the people, the foundation, which is the population of that country. The population of that country has not put up with the repression of this regime. Otherwise, this regime did not have to execute and hang 10 people at a time at the corner, at the street corners. We had that in the recent months that has been happening, or cut hands and legs in public to create fear. If this was a regime that people have put up and they were going out about their own ways, the regime didn't have to do that. So there are very clear evidence that a very healthy, strong, organized, and expansive movement against this regime. They need international help not to strengthen the regime. Instead, they strengthen the resistant movement.
Help to be asking some accountability of the regime, and to be able to send in monitors that can look more deeply, or they're just not allowed to look.
So they are not allowed, but what do? You accept that? No. Then you say, okay, then you cannot be a representative of this country in UN. We have to give the seat to an organizations or a number of organizations
who will give the figures.
Representation, yes. So there are policy options. U.S. Congressmen, congresswomen, senators, members of the media. We need to reach out to them and tell them, this is what we are hearing. We don't want to. I mean, we are putting U.S. In a difficult position by not standing up to the Iranian regime.
And so that's, as individuals, that's what you would like to see happen, is to have more individuals trying to contact the leaders, whoever is their community leaders, their presidential candidates, their UN delegates, their congressmen and women.
And provide, I mean, this is the age of information. This is a knowledge, age of knowledge. The more you learn, the more you understand, just like the letter I read earlier. The more you can resist and take actions to remove the barrier for development and progress. If we ignore what's happening in Iran and the growth of fundamentalism, it's gonna eventually, directly and indirectly, impact. So as a member of this society, I like to encourage my colleagues at wherever I am, at work, at school, and friends, family, that voice your opposition. Talk to the members of the media, talk to the members of the parliament in any country, and let them know, when you have relationship with this government, consider this. They are the worst enemy of their own people. Do you want to have a trade relationship with them, to encourage them to continue that atrocities, which will eventually impact your own country?
Why are we doing business?
Yes, and we have these leverages. It doesn't require us sending any soldiers or have any war. As I said earlier, if you strengthen the family, who needs to protect their house, they can protect their house, and then provide the governance in that community so that they can allow to have a safe community, a safe neighborhood. They will do that. That's the human nature. So you have no doubt that Iranian people would like liberty, freedom, peace, development, and a very good relationship with their neighboring countries. They do not want to dominate. They have many, many issues in Iran that they would like to see those solved. Iran is a very multi-ethnic, multicultural country. People by default, they are fine with diversity, and therefore they can be actually a catalyst in bringing stability and peace in the region.
Let me ask you about your website, the United for a Free Iran.
Yes.
And what can people expect to find if they go to that website?
I am still working on that website, but I am planning to build a social network among people around the world who would like to see freedom and democracy in Iran. They could be Iranian or non-Iranian, and they would participate in activities, either participate in the research, participate in cultural, educational, and advocacy programs that would help create that policy option, policy change, as I mentioned. Also, but there are a number of organizations, especially womenfreedomforum.org has plenty of research material and news regarding the Iranian women movement, the grassroots.
I understand the United Nations has a council and I forgot to write down the information, but because we're taping this on International Women's Day, and there was a celebration in San Jose with some speakers, and the United Nations was a contributor or a sponsor to that. I went to the website for one of those parties and found a wealth of information about what was going on with United Nations. So if people wanted to explore that online, I think then they could we could also help support what's happening by getting in touch and becoming members of some of those organizations, or just writing in and asking questions and finding out what's happening.
Definitely. I did, I think, the declaration of UNIFEM. Today I was reading that they announced the top issue of 200,000 people who signed that declaration. The top issue is violence against women. So if this is the top issue around the world, in Iran we have violence against women that is sanctioned, legalized, and operated by the regime. So you can see how bad it can be at the family level, as I mentioned with the honor killing. So definitely people can sign up, go to those websites, but definitely try to align these protests and advocacy toward a policy change. And definitely, if I wanted to summarize, is that the Iranian people's movement for democracy and freedom has a very strong history in the past 100 years, major milestones, and the international community can definitely help and strengthen it by at least
So it's not like we even have to teach anything to bring those about. We just need to remove the block.
Exactly. Reflect them. Let the news reach you. Let the news reach you and support them. Announce your solidarity. This can give a big moral boost to all these women who's protesting.
Thank you, Seema, for being our guest tonight and for giving us such important information, and I appreciate your time here with us.
Thank you.
In conclusion, I would just like to add that we do have an alternative to consider, and that is demanding from our leaders that human rights violations become topics of grave importance. If we appease Iran's fundamentalist regime rather than demanding changes, we risk our safety at home.